Northern Ireland's John Watson, to some a perennial support player and unfulfilled talent, to others one of the greatest racers and overtakers of the modern era. 2 of his 5 victories came from as far back as 17th and 22nd on the grid. He had to measure himself against teammates like Lauda and Prost, and was highly competitive against some of the greatest champions of the modern era. His father was a Belfast motor trader. His progress to Grand Prix racing was swift, and he would emerge from it all with a fascinating perspective on Formula One in the 70s and 80s. John, take us back to the very beginning, boyhood days in Belfast in Northern Ireland. Was there a kind of inevitability that you were going to head toward motorsport with the family background and the family support?
Well, I felt there was, but I think my family felt that they were happy to see me compete in Ireland, really racing at weekends as a fun activity, a family activity, and then during the week get into the business and make a bit of money and eventually take over the motor business from my father. I didn't really have that aspiration. I'd had this dream I wanted to be a racing driver or a Grand Prix driver, but there was no natural avenue or path to follow. And while there had been a number of successful, not professional, amateurs, professional drivers in Ireland in the 50s, none of them had ever really moved forward in the way that I was hoping to do in the 70s. So eventually, with a little bit of assistance from my family and a lot of persuasion, we ended up getting a Formula 2 Brabham in 1970. And then, in a sense, that was me out of Belfast and, in a way, never to return in terms of going back into the family business.
So you were focused at that point. It was always going to be Grand Prix racing. It was always going to be Formula One. Who were the inspirational characters around at that time that really sort of helped fire your imagination?
Well, I think the one driver that stood out amongst all others was Juan Manuel Fangio, because he was just so special. By the time he retired, he'd won 5 World Championships and 5 Grand Prix. But of course, Stirling Moss, Mike Hawthorne, Peter Collins, the British drivers. And I got to see these drivers actually competing in Ireland in a great historic British race in Ireland called the Tourist Trophy at Dundrod. In 1955, the works Mercedes, Jaguars, Aston Martins, Ferraris, Maseratis, and their respective drivers were all present. And I was 9 years of age in the paddock, and these were people that I'd read about, and all of a sudden I'm standing beside Stirling Moss or Mike Hawthorne. Or, you had to pinch yourself to believe it was true. And it in a way, that was the point, I think, that I realised there was something more to motor racing than just what I'd seen through my family in Northern Ireland.
And Stirling shows how to do it. Hot foot and cool head.
His talent was firmly established in Formula 2. His World Championship Formula 1 debut came in a Brabham BT37 at the 1973 British Grand Prix, a grid full of the superstars of the sport. And when you looked around you on the grid, the familiar faces and the great reputations around you, what were the emotions you were feeling before that race?
Mostly cowing, out of respect and the thought of having Denny Hulme come along and tell you to watch your mirrors, or Jackie Stewart, or whoever it was. I mean, I think one of the differences that in Formula One of today is that there's a difference in the kind of respect that my generation of drivers would have given to the great stars and world champions of the day. And to be in the present, in the same room as a world champion was, almost unbearable. Just how things have changed.
The progress from that point, the first World Championship point, I think, came in Monaco a year later.
Believe it or not, this little private Brabham entered by Hexagon, driven by me, was having a battle with Emerson Fittipaldi in the mighty McLaren Ford, and Emerson and I were fighting for 5th place. Ronnie came up behind to lap both of us, and I was aware he was leading the race and didn't give him the consideration that I should have done by letting the leader get through and then continue my battle. So at the end of the race, and whatever after, Ronnie said, "You must not ever do what..." I mean, his English was Swinglish, not English. So it was a Swinglish version of English. And I said, "Oh, sorry, Ronnie, I didn't mean to." But it was that kind of little lesson that, it didn't take the joy off the one single point, but it was a lesson that even you're involved in your own battles, respect the leader of the race.
There is also an illustration that your reputation was growing, your presence in the sport was growing. There were other teams that you drove for, but the breakthrough came with Penske, I think.
Yes, I mean, in a sense, my first 2 seasons were single seasons with a given team, second season with the John Surtees. And at the end of 75, Roger Penske, his team was being, Mark Donohue was the team's driver, and part of the Penske motor racing emporium. Tragically, Mark lost his life in Austria and had a Sunday morning went off and was hit in the head by a catch fence pole. So in those days, you could walk around the paddock and you could talk to rival teams and team managers and drivers, and there's nothing sinister about it. And I remember speaking to the Penske team, and they said, well, look, would you let us know what your plans are for the future? Because we don't know what we're going to be doing in 76, but sort of we'd like to have you as somebody to think we could talk to, and if there's an opportunity, maybe put an offer. And through the tragedy of losing Mark Donohue, that offer came then much sooner. So I was able to drive for Penske in the final race in Watkins Glen in 75, and then for the 76 season.
And in that 76 season, well, a couple of races to pick out, of course, notably Nürburgring, the race that sort of entered into legend with the film that's been issued recently, yes, and the dreadful accident that befell Niki Lauda. And you were pretty close to all that, weren't you?
They dragged him out of the car. Mazzario had dragged him out, but he was helmetless. In fact, there was no balaclava on either. And I said, look, the surface is covered in liquid. I don't know whether it was fuel or water or oil. So we walked Niki back up the racetrack. And then I knelt down on my knees and I got him to lie down and put his head in my lap. So the idea was to try and keep him calm and do what we thought was the best thing for him in the circumstances. But when he was in that position, he said, what's my face look like? What's my face look like? And this part of his forehead, you could tell, had been severely burned. But the worst burning was actually in his scalp, because his scalp was charred black in places. So I said, no, you're fine, don't worry about it, you'll be okay, and the ambulance is on its way and they'll get you to hospital. Little did we realize that those horrible burn injuries were actually not the life-threatening injuries that he suffered in the remaining sort of 48 hours after the accident. He had inhaled poisonous fumes from the resins and the fiberglass and the bodywork, and that's what nearly, literally did for him.
It was ironic that immediately after the near tragedy of Lauda at Nürburgring, the next race was the Austrian Grand Prix. It was at the Österreichring the previous year that Penske driver Mark Donohue had lost his life. Now, a year on, John Watson had put his Penske on the front row.
We just had a car and a job to do, and the car worked extremely well there and got into a strong position in practice and qualifying, and then eventually won the race. And I think that in motor racing, a lot of things, they happen. You've got to move on. As tragic as it was 1 year earlier, we were celebrating a victory at the very venue that the tragedy had occurred. I mean, it's irony in a way. For Roger, it was winning a Formula One World Championship Grand Prix. It's the only one the team did win, but it's an important part of his legacy. And for me, it was fulfillment of a dream and confirmation of potential or ability, or whatever you care to choose. And you elevate yourself from being a Grand Prix driver to being a Grand Prix winner. And of course, then the next step would be to be a world champion. But being a Grand Prix winner gave you that little bit of additional status within the paddock that if you hadn't won a Grand Prix, you wouldn't be able to enjoy.
In theory, it should have changed everything, but it did change the way you looked, because up until that point, you've been sporting this big, sort of striking, buccaneering kind of beard, and the next morning you were required to get rid of that. Was that part of a bet with Roger Penske?
When I joined the team in 75, Roger ran a team which I would describe as an Ivy League. It was the cleanest cut team in motorsport in America. And so we had an agreement that if we won a Grand Prix, or when we won a Grand Prix, I would shave the beard. So came back to England on the Sunday night. Roger was flying out of Heathrow on Monday morning, so we agreed to meet in the hotel coffee shop for breakfast. That evening I went up to my room, walked into the bathroom, dutifully shaved, and I got a shock because I hadn't seen myself without a beard for, I think, about 8 or 9 years. And because, the summer was a very good summer, my face was well coloured. But of course, when you take the beard off, you're this big white area. Came down to breakfast the following morning to meet Roger and Heinz. And I'm sitting there when they walk into the breakfast room. And Roger's looking around and says, "Hey, where's Watson? Where's Watson?" And I go, "Roger, Roger." He knew the voice, but he couldn't see the person. "Over here, Roger." He didn't actually believe I was going to shave it. Maybe not shave it as quickly as I did.
So John Watson had a new look and a new reputation as a race winner. But as the 70s went on, he would have a new challenge: Niki Lauda as a teammate at Brabham. In Austria in 1976, John Watson had made the breakthrough as a Grand Prix winner. But victory number 2 would be 5 years away. In between would come frustrating times with the unreliable Brabham. He dominated the 1977 French Grand Prix, only to be denied victory on the very last lap by a fuel metering problem. There'd be 3 podiums in 1978, but he was still outscored by his new teammate Niki Lauda, who was the master of getting the best out of team support.
The differences between drivers are probably not a huge amount to do with ability, but it's the way that some people manage to put themselves into a position. And usually the drivers have put themselves into these strong positions, and Niki being one of them, and other world champions. Jackie Stewart is an example. They know how to pull a team of people into their favour. And it may not necessarily be that they are the quickest driver on the grid or the best driver on the grid, but they're the one that knows how to ensure that they get the best equipment within the team that they've got. And invariably they're pretty good, however you want to measure them. But that skill was something that Niki had, which I'd never seen before. In '77 in Brabham, when I had another teammate, Hans Stuck, he didn't have that quality that Niki had. So effectively, I had a reasonably easy time in a car that was very competitive. But Niki coming into the team was a game changer. And so I learned a little bit about Niki. I remember, in fact, in Monaco in 1978, towards the end of qualifying, I was second quickest, and Niki was fourth, I think. I'd done my qualifying run, and I had 1 spare set of tyres remaining. Came in with about 5 minutes to go, stopped in my little box in the pit lane. "Okay, guys, last set of tyres." And they went, "No, you've used your tyres." I said, "No, I've only used 3 sets." "Niki's got them." Niki came in, said, "Oh, I could have got pole position lap. I got blocked on the lap. 1 more set of tyres. I guarantee you I can get pole position." And Bernie said, whose are those tyres?" They said, "Those are John's." "Put them on Lauda's car." And that was an example of the power that Niki had.
But was that Niki thinking, right, I am number 1 and John Watson is my supportive teammate?
I don't think he thought of it in that sense. He just thought of it, I'm Niki Lauda. I'm a 2 times world champion. I've got control of the team. And he didn't make any excuses about it. He said, "Yeah, I'll do it. I've got to do what I've got to do, and I take your tyres. Thank you very much. Thank you for the tyres. Very much." As it happens, it didn't make any difference. He started fourth. But it was just an illustration that the persuasiveness of Niki and in a sense, sowing in Bernie the belief that actually Niki's the guy that's going to deliver. It's an illustration of the way a driver of Niki's capacity was able to shape things to suit him and gain an advantage. And if you can gain that advantage over your teammate, then it makes beating that teammate on the racetrack a little bit easier.
In 1979, Watson joined McLaren. The team that had taken James Hunt to the world title 3 years earlier were now struggling. 7th in that season's Constructors' Championship, would the arrival of a young talent named Alain Prost revive their fortunes in the new decade?
It was a difficult time at McLaren because they failed to really fully embrace what was ground effects, and other teams were doing a much better job. And McLaren produced one of the worst cars they've ever made, sadly, and then they replaced it with a car that was slightly better. In 1980, Alain Prost joined, and it was an immediate, obviously, when he came into the team, this is a special character. And he got more out of the car in those early days than I was doing. But the team then, I think, realised, well, maybe the problem that we have had is not the car, maybe it was John or the other driver. And they used Alain, I think, as the measurement of the car's performance. Ultimately, when they produced another model at the end of 1980, which was the M30, they realised that the game was up, that it was inevitable that John Barnard and Ron Dennis were going to come in. And in fact, at the end of the 1980 season, John Barnard worked with me in the final 2 Grand Prix with the M29, and we got a bunch more performance out of the car than Alain was getting out of the M30.
The strong end of season, especially 4th place in the Canadian Grand Prix, had helped salvage Watson's McLaren career. And as McLaren became McLaren International under Ron Dennis and John Barnard in 1981, the revival would continue. There was a podium finish in the Spanish Grand Prix, and then Watson's MP4 chased home Alain Prost in the Renault in the French Grand Prix at Dijon. It meant there were strong hopes of a British victory at Silverstone 2 weeks later, even though John Watson was the only British driver in the lineup.
Are you going to win or not, John, at Silverstone? Don't ask those questions. And of course, the nature of Silverstone suited the turbo cars because they had a lot more performance, particularly in qualifying, not maybe quite so much in the race, but it gave them the advantage on the grid, particularly the 2 Renaults of Prost and Arnoux, and qualified 4th row or something, had a reasonable start, but was caught behind Alan Jones and Gilles Villeneuve.
The Woodcote chicane.
The Woodcote chicane. Yeah. I mean, Gilles, I've described it as a hyperactive kid in a racing car. And his car control was unbelievable. But eventually, even he couldn't control this bucking Bronco, which is what the Ferrari was. He lost it just at the end of the chicane.
And off goes the Ferrari. Into the catch fencing goes De Cesaris.
But Watson at least managed to get away. You see John Watson on the left of your screen there.
Alan was directly behind. He had to lock up. I was behind him. So luckily I was able to look slightly through the corner and see what Villeneuve was doing and was anticipating at some point him losing control. So I had a little bit of warning that something was about to happen. But Alan was too close, so he was sort of right up against the side of the Ferrari. I managed to avoid contact with the 2 cars ahead of me. My teammate, Andrea De Cesaris, a young guy, you know, very quick, but his peripheral vision was just focused on my gearbox. So he was doing this, like driving like this. And all of a sudden he saw my car stopping quickly. He just disappeared sharp left and went into the catch fencing. He should have won the race.
Yes.
The smoke cleared, because I'd had to brake so heavily, the engine had stalled. But there was still a little bit of momentum when I got off the brakes. So I had to put the fuel pump back on again, drop the clutch, put it into gear, and bump started it. And luckily it caught, and off I went. So I'd overtaken 3 or 4 cars up to that point, and then had to go through a whole process of catching cars that had been behind me and passing them and then passing others. But of course, then the lead Renaults and I think Piquet all had problems. Piquet had a shunt at Beckett's, Alan had a mechanical problem, and eventually Arnoux, I don't know what happened, he lost power. So I went through the field and eventually found myself leading the race.
John Watson, the man from Ulster, leads the 1981 British Grand Prix on lap 61 out of 68.
Which was a nice feeling, but having been mindful of what had happened on other occasions, and in particular at Dijon 77, when on the final lap the car ran out of fuel, I didn't want to allow any emotion to affect what I was doing. And one of the great memories of those closing laps in the Grand Prix was seeing Ron Dennis, who was in his first season in Formula One, not the person he is today, over the barriers, slow down, slow down. So the way you slow down is not to slow down in a corner, but what I was doing was I was just dropping the RPM. So going from 10,600 or whatever we would have used normally, I ended up revving to about 9,000. And it was making almost no difference in a lap time. And eventually the flag came out and won the race.
And the British Grand Prix has been won by a British car with a British driver. His name, John Watson. And there's the victory salute.
And it was a very special moment. McLaren were competitive. They'd just won a Grand Prix, which they hadn't done. I think the last time they won a Grand Prix was in 77 or something.
For McLaren, this win was the starting point of a great new era, and it was the first victory for a car with a carbon fibre monocoque. 2 months later at the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, Watson demonstrated the further strength of this new technology.
That's John Watson, and a very nasty one indeed. Torn the whole of the back off the car.
I'm sitting in the car going, well, I'm going to hit the barrier. What can I do? So I just sat there, braced myself, closed my eyes, bang, and looked up. And there's a Cosworth engine sliding across the racetrack. I thought, who was behind me? They must have the biggest shunt of their lives. Got out of the car, walked, and I looked. That was my engine. I didn't realise that the rearward impact and the gearbox had got wedged between the barrier and the barrier mounting pole. It had been levered off, and the engine equally was levered off, so the gearbox was wedged in the barrier. The engine had slid across the racetrack. I was left sitting in the carbon fibre tub. Even the gear lever had gone, had been pulled out through the tub. I didn't even know any of this, because it must have gone through in milliseconds. And I wasn't injured, I didn't have any pain.
And there was a huge amount of fire. There was a great flash as well.
I didn't know a thing about that until I got back to the pits. And everybody was, are you all right? Are you okay? Oh, we thought you were dead. So, oh, it wasn't that bad. Oh, you should have seen the flames. There was, what flame? I didn't see anything. I only ever saw it later that evening when I got back to the hotel and realised there had been, it was a vapour flame. I mean, it was nothing more than that. And because I was moving away from it, there was no singeing or marks of flame or fire anywhere on the car at all. So I got back to the pits, said, sorry guys, it's a bit of a mess. You know, didn't mean it. Apologies. And that was about it. 3 days after Monza, I had to go to Donington Park because a certain Lauda N wanted to come back, make a comeback. And he'd organised a test in my car or the spare car. So I rocked up at Donington, jumped in the car, drove it. I did the quickest lap I'd ever done in that car, in fact, on that day. And then Nicky drove the car, and based on what he did, he made a decision to make a comeback. So, I mean, it was a big accident by any standards, but I didn't realise the extent of it. And having seen it, I can't actually even today relate what I see with what happened.
So Watson had a car he could compete in, as well as a car he could survive in. And 1982 promised to be a highly competitive season, alongside a highly competitive teammate. Niki Lauda was back. "1982 will always be remembered as a tragic, dramatic Formula One season. There was the death of the great Gilles Villeneuve at Zolder, the drivers' strike in South Africa, and the battle for the title which John Watson took to a last-round decider in Las Vegas. Niki Lauda had joined Watson at McLaren and won the Long Beach Grand Prix, but the exchanges between him and Watson had been pretty even through the first 4 races. Then came the Belgian Grand Prix and the fatal accident of Villeneuve in practice.
You were there at the accident scene, and what sort of effect did that have on you?
Nothing.
Really?
Nothing. I mean, I got out of my car. I realised it was a Ferrari driver. I didn't know who it was. The body, the person up against the catch fencing, got out, walked over, realised it was Gilles Villeneuve. To me, looked in his eyes looked dead. What can you do? Got in my car, went back to the pits, told the team that Villeneuve had died, and I think I went into the motorhome and had a coffee or something. You know, you've got to... I certainly was able to implement mechanisms to shut out, you know, not pleasant things. I mean, there's lots of unpleasant things early in my career, but you know, to look at a driver lying dead by the side of the racetrack is not something you want to do every day of the week. But you have to compartmentalize it. And I had the capacity and the ability to do so. And you know, it is sad, but it's sad not for Gilles, because he had a great life and a great career, and he loved what he was doing. And the moment, the millisecond that he lost his life, he didn't know anything about it. The sadness is for those who are left behind. His wife, his children. But Gilles was a risk taker. And, you know, he took a lot of risks, and tragically this one cost him his life.
But there was never a moment that, I mean, you hear from a lot of drivers in those circumstances, they come away and they question, you know, why are we racing, should we be out there, and so on. There was never even a half hour of doubt in that respect.
No. You've got to look after yourself. You've got to make your judgments. You've got to work within a framework of what is feasible and what's not feasible. And, I mean, if you want to push the envelope to the degree that maybe Gilles did do and some other drivers have done, that's an individual's choice. But it's possible to be a very effective Grand Prix driver within the sphere of the margins and not putting yourself into a dangerous situation. It's a different thing if there's a mechanical issue, something fails in the car, then you're a passenger, or there's oil on the track and you get caught out by that. Those are things that you haven't got control over. But the things that you can control, in my opinion, are the things that you should control. And, I mean, lots of great drivers have lost their lives. But if you look at the great world champions, Jackie Stewart, Niki Lauda, I mean, Fangio, others, even Nelson Piquet, 3 times world champion, they are intelligent people. And they applied intelligence in their role as a Grand Prix driver. And I don't think they took risks above those that they felt they could control.
The race itself, despite the sombre atmosphere of Zolder, Watson rates as one of his best, and a tactical triumph for his long-time team boss.
I have to give Teddy Mayer credit for that win. Because on Sunday morning, you know, Gilles had died, and there was an atmosphere and an emotion in the paddock, but you've got a job to do. You've got to get out and do it. So on the Sunday morning warm-up, it was actually abnormally warm for the time of day. Went out, did 3 laps, 4 laps, came in. Teddy, left front, is giving up. And Teddy, being pragmatic, turned round and said to one of the guys, see that set of tyres over there? We'll put the left-hand side onto the left-hand side of John's car. I said, what tyres are those, Teddy? He said, it doesn't matter. What are they? I want to know. He said, the tyres that Giacomelli had used in Las Vegas 1 year ago, and they worked a treat. And I went out with a negative attitude because I prejudged what I thought the tyre was going to do. Went out, first lap out, and in those days, a cold tyre on the left side and a warm tyre on the right side, the car would not be comfortable. So at the end of the first lap, it began to feel better. In the first flying lap, the tyre started to come to life, it started to work. And after 3 or 4 laps, I thought, 2 thumbs up, this is the trick I'm going to use in the race. Because the tyre was stable, and in terms of lap time, it was no slower than the matched set of tyres I was originally planning to use. And came in and said, definitely going to use these tyres. As long as the ambient temperature stays high, without doubt, that's the way to go. And when we were in the garage talking, then Nicky wandered up because he was aware of what times I'd done. He said, oh, what you doing? What? And I said, I've just done a run on those tyres. They're like concrete and clay. And I'm telling you now, those are the tyres to run on the left-hand side of your car. Because if you don't do it, I promise you after 3 or 4 laps, you're going to start picking up understeer, and I'm going to pass you like tomorrow. And he thought about it, and I said, what are you going to do? You're going to, I'm telling you. And I never lied, I never misled him. I didn't do politics, though probably what I was doing was that. And he said, no, I'm not going to do it. I said, you're an idiot. Why not? He said, And he reluctantly told me, I haven't tried them. I went, hooray.
As Watson is now right up into Lauda's slipstream, a new second-place man.
Yes, I think Watson will have a go now, but Lauda didn't help him through previously when he showed him his nose, but there he goes. Nicky doesn't fight it, and John Watson straight through into second place.
Another little insight into my teammate, that part of his discipline in his motor racing life, and it follows through in his personal life as well, is that he is not prepared to do something which is slightly off-centre. He knew I was right, and he knew that probably what I'd said was going to happen, but because he hadn't tried it for himself, he couldn't bring himself to break a discipline of a lifetime in a Formula One car.
Yes.
Sweet as a nut, Steve, sweet as a nut.
And now John Watson is within sight of that checkered flag, and the Belgian Grand Prix has been won by John Watson.
A month later came a different kind of win. The MP4B was always a struggle to qualify, but the car and the tyres came alive in the race. This was certainly the story of the Detroit Grand Prix, where Watson started reeling the opposition in from his qualifying position of 17th on the grid.
Watson having a go at Loudon, and he's through.
So I found myself catching people because the car was working. And then I came up to a group of 3 cars, of which Nicky was the third, Cheever and Pironi. So going into turn 1, put a strong move in Nicky. 4th corner, Cheever, Bosch, past him. 6th corner, Pironi, Bosch, past him.
And now Watson's going through into 2nd position. Unbelievable, but he's done it.
The team were really upset with Nicky because what he had done is part of his character, and this is what I'd benefited from with being with him previously. He sometimes decides that something isn't possible, and he sticks with that. So he was just sitting, trundling around behind Cheever and Pironi, thinking you couldn't pass on this racetrack. This thicko from Ireland comes along and goes, Bosch, Bosch, Bosch. Oh, put another chip in the brain. Now you can pass. So he then passed Cheever and Pironi as well. Eventually I catch up to Keke Rosberg, who is leading on the road, but leading on time as well. Came up past Keke into turn 1. On the previous couple of laps, I'd taken 3 or 4 seconds a lap out of him. He thought, I'm not going to win this race, John is. Nicky came up and he dithered. He went, if you're going to pass, do it. Make your intentions known, and you can do that from your car. You can make the driver ahead of you know you're coming through. Make no mistakes about it. If I don't come through, we're both going out. So Nicky sort of dithered. Keke then shut the door, knocked Nicky's nose and wing off, and he was out of the race. And eventually I went on to win the race. And the reason I won was because, on the one hand, I did a good job. On the other hand, because the car did a good job. The car was fantastic. Easy to drive, put it anywhere on the racetrack, good balance, good traction. I mean, I didn't think I did anything different to any other Grand Prix that I'd ever driven in, but just the circumstances of the day and the car worked for me.
The checkered flag goes, and John Watson has, in the McLaren, won his 4th Grand Prix in his career. Can you go on and win the championship?
Well, we'll try. That's the purpose of racing.
I'm sure a lot of people in the sport would have been surprised because this was the nice, mild-mannered John Watson, and suddenly it's John Watson the racer, and decisive and aggressive and overtaking the entire field. Did a certain aspect of that surprise you as well?
No, and I always felt that, overtaking and racing was something that I was capable of doing. And if you need to brake late, for example, which sometimes is a good ploy to get into position to take a place away from another driver. It's not necessarily the best way to do a quickest lap, but it can be an asset when you want to overtake somebody. So if you've got the ability to brake very late and possibly compromise yourself, but more the other person, then use it. And I was good at that.
Got a short straight coming now, and then a right angle left. That's right. No, it's not close enough.
The first 2 turbo cars, Piquet and Rosberg, are going to have to come in and refuel. We don't know the situation with Prost, and through to 3rd place goes John Watson. Magnificent. James.
Yes, marvellous piece of overtaking that by Watson.
And when you get confidence also in overtaking, you then realise that the people that you're overtaking, they see you coming, and they think, oh no, here he is again. He's going to pass me anyway. So they almost subconsciously begin to make your overtaking easier, because what they don't often want is continual pressure. And if you get them doing this in the mirrors,
Intimidation.
they're done.
Yeah.
You got them.
Watson, I think, now has possibly arguably established himself as the best overtaker in the business.
2 wins in 3 races, Watson was championship leader as the season headed toward the halfway point. He had a spectacular car and he had the measure of his world champion teammate. 1982 was his great chance for the title. After his surge to the top of the championship standings, the second half of the 1982 season was more of a struggle for John Watson in the McLaren. Only one podium finish in Canada had followed his dramatic win in Detroit. And when they reached Las Vegas for the season finale, Keke Rosberg led the championship, but Watson still had a chance at the title.
How strong a chance did you feel you had coming into that race?
I mean, it was a very long shot because, again, it wasn't in my hands totally. I mean, my rule was clear. I had to win the race. That was all I had to do, win the race. Keke had to finish 5th or lower for me to be world champion. I couldn't control what Keke was doing. All I had to do was to control what I could do. And I got into second place behind Alboreto.
There he is. He's going through. He nips through past Alan Prost, and now it's a straight chase against Michele Alboreto.
And the Tyrrell that day happened to be particularly strong. And, reduced the gap, the lead that he had, but wasn't able to run him down. And so consequently, Keke finished 5th, and I finished 2nd, and Keke walked away the world champion.
And there, taking the last corner on the last lap, is the world champion of 1982, Keke Rosberg.
At the time, did you feel that was going to be the best chance of your career, or did you feel that more opportunities would lie ahead? This team was starting to fly.
Well, the team, clearly staying with the team would have been a nice confirmation, but we didn't actually have a contract for the first 2 or 3 races for a variety of reasons in '83.
Those contractual reasons, did they come from you, or was it Ron trying to keep options open?
No, I think it was just both sides. There's always discussions. I mean, if you think what Senna and Ron did much later, I mean, it was I didn't have a contract till mid-season, so sometimes these things didn't quite. But in my part, there was good faith, and the team provided me with a car. But it was difficult because '83 was going to be a transitional year for McLaren, because the TAG turbo engine that Porsche were designing and building for McLaren was a long way off. So on paper, '83 was going to be more difficult in some respects than '82 had been, because the Renault, Ferrari, even Alfa Romeo, and maybe Brabham with the BMW engine were beginning not only to get reliability, but get performance and economy. So the turbo period was really consolidating in '83 and mitigating against a Cosworth engine car. So while we had a very good race car and a quick race car, we were ending up being further and further back down the grid in qualifying. Just simply we were being out-horsepowered in qualifying by the turbos.
And that was certainly the story into 1983. There'd be no chance of the title, although Watson did have the satisfaction of finishing higher than Lauda. And he also featured in one of the most extraordinary races in Grand Prix history. At Long Beach, the McLarens were once again disastrous in qualifying. Watson 22nd, Lauda 23rd. In the race, astonishingly, it was Watson first, Lauda second.
In the race, more fuel on board. Again, the same thing, putting weight into the tyre and getting the energy into the tyre. The car, again, came alive. So Nicky and I went through the field in tandem. Other drivers had problems, some had shunts. Reliability in those days, of course, was a much poorer aspect of Formula One than it is today. So we got through the field and we got to being first and second.
And John Watson is coming up to take Niki Lauda. A spurt of smoke from his tyre there, and he's gone through with a beautiful passing manoeuvre, and that seems to show that there's certainly no team orders in the McLaren team.
Towards the end of the straight, I took a bit of a punt down the inside. Came from quite a long way behind. Nicky maybe hadn't anticipated it. Got alongside, the car sort of fidgeted around, moved around a bit. He had to move to the left. He didn't think it was very funny, didn't like it, but I'd gotten the lead, and once I was in the lead, then all I had to do was drive to the flag. But again, it wasn't something that either of us had done. We were doing our job.
22nd remains the lowest on the grid from which any driver has won a Grand Prix, and Watson won the race by a margin of 28 seconds. So what was the reaction in the McLaren garage?
Stone silence, basically. Got back to the pits, and You know, what they couldn't work out was how could we be so far down in the grid and then win the race. They weren't able to put the logical reason into context, which was simply that we had a car that was extremely gentle on its tyres, especially in a low configuration, fuel configuration, but was a great race car because we got the temperature. And whereas the turbo cars, who put a lot more energy into the tyres, we got that temperature, but then would probably destroy their tyre because they just overworked it.
I've always said that as long as I enjoyed driving racing cars and competing in Grand Prix, I will continue to race.
But as the season progressed and no similar heroics followed, it seemed that time was running out for Watson at McLaren. His big title chance had gone the year before, and McLaren were planning a big-name driver lineup to match their growing ambitions.
Nicky called me on Monday to say, look, be very careful. Prost is looking to take your seat. And in fairness, it was a no-brainer, because McLaren had two drivers. I was 3 years older than Nicky. They were looking at a potential multiple world champion in Alain coming on the market almost for free, with the potential for a 3-5 year term at McLaren. So if I'd been Ron Dennis, I'd have done the deal with Prost as well. And you know, I was a victim of the circumstance. It was nothing to do with me or my performance. It was just, here's an opportunity. I was 37, I think, at the time. Alain was probably about middle 20s. And everybody acknowledged that Alain is a world champion in the waiting. Nicky was 35. And, well, will he win a world championship or not? I mean, he went on to win in '84, the world championship. But the combination of Prost and Lauda was the decision they went down. They chose to go down that route. And commercially, in every sense of the team, it was the right judgment.
Were you getting the feeling that my career has run its course and this is the right time? Or was there deeper frustration?
It was disappointing because it was a situation which I didn't control. It wasn't my decision to leave McLaren. I would like to have continued on with the team for a further year. But it wasn't my judgment. It was made for me or on my behalf by the team, looking after their interests. Later in the season, or well, just before Christmas, I think, there were discussions with Lotus. And Peter Warr and my management and we met up. I got the feeling that because Nigel was in the team at that time, and there was not a lot of love, I think, between Peter Warr and Nigel Mansell. But because they were sponsored by a British tobacco company, they needed to have a British driver. And I think Peter really would have done anything to dump Nigel. And I became available, so the conversation was held. But I realised they didn't want me. They just didn't want Nigel. And they were on, at that time, they had Pirelli tyres, and McLaren were on, I think, Michelin, and Goodyear were very strong as well. And there were a number of other issues. And I've led my life pretty much based on instinct and intuition. I'm not a go-getter, deal-maker, hustler, character. It's not my sort of personality. And it didn't feel right. And I'd had 151 Grand Prix at that point, a 10-year career. I was fit, alive. Trust instinct or intuition and say thank you, but no thank you.
Yeah.
Which is what I did.
After Formula One came a distinguished few seasons in sports car racing, winning 3 World Championship races, before the voice of John Watson became a very familiar and knowledgeable accompaniment to a whole range of motorsport broadcasting. All this at the end of a career that might well have produced more, but still delivered more than most.
When your motor racing career concludes, and my Formula One career ended effectively '83, and I was able to then move into world sports car racing, which was a very nice taper from the intensity of what Formula One is, even then, as it is today. So we're not going cold turkey and saying, I'm retiring, and then a week later thinking, what have I done? So the taper was world sports cars. And then at the end of the 80s, I was back in the Formula One paddock. I was, in effect, a Grand Prix driver, but I wasn't driving a car, I was driving a microphone. And you get all the adrenaline rush and all the fulfillment, in a way, outside of the pure physical fulfillment of being a driver. But it is great, Steve. You know what it's like. It's wonderful. It is a fantastic way to earn a living.
And it's a fantastic way to stay in contact with a sport that you graced at the highest level, and it's been fascinating to hear the stories. John, thanks very much indeed.